My name is Alyssa Greengrass Summer, and I am the chair of the Young Friends Board here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. I would like to recognize Jack Klieger, the president and CEO of our museum, and extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Diane, who has joined us for this important event. I would also like to thank Rabbi Wilds and the team from the Manhattan Jewish Experience for co-hosting this program with us, our event chair, Miriam Leichtling, for helping to craft and create tonight's program. Additionally, to my fellow Young Friends Board members, thank you for all of your hard work and dedication, not only to this event, but to our museum's crucial Holocaust education mission. Lastly, thank you to our staff liaison, Lindsay Mallon, for your endless hard work and support of this group. For more than 20 years, this museum has served as New York's contribution to the global responsibility to never forget. It has become the primary resource in New York for teaching and learning about the Holocaust and has taken its place as the third largest Holocaust museum in the world. We are proud to have welcomed more than 2 million diverse visitors, including over 800,000 students through our doors to learn about Jewish heritage and the Holocaust. My reasons for getting involved at this museum are simple. I am the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. Both of my dad's parents had their own experiences and families. They met one another in a displaced persons camp in Germany after the war, got married, and moved to the South Bronx. My grandpa Charlie, born and raised in Poland, was taken from his home with his wife and 13-year-old son to Auschwitz. While there, he had to bear witness to the unimaginable, including the execution of his son. Miraculously, he was able to escape the camp with his brother and make his way to Czechoslovakia, where they both lived in the woods for 8 months until the end of the war. My grandma Steffi and her family were taken from their homes in Hungary as a part of the final solution in 1944. In less than a year, Steffi was shuffled between 5 different camps, including Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, where she was ultimately liberated. She lost 7 brothers and sisters, her parents, her husband, and her 6-month-old baby girl. I wish I had more time to tell you all about the incredible stories of my grandparents, but Steffi and Charlie were just 2 out of around 1.3 million people who were sent to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945. And while the world remained silent, 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, including so many members of my family. On May 8th, this museum will debut the most comprehensive exhibition on Auschwitz ever shown in North America, Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. 74 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, this exhibit tells the transformation story of how an ordinary Polish town turned into the most significant Nazi site in the Holocaust. Presented in partnership with the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland and the international exhibition firm Musealia, this exhibit features more than 700 objects and 400 photographs, including 100 rare artifacts from collections of this museum. This exhibit, this museum, and the Young Friends are committed to sharing the many lessons of the Holocaust with our community. These lessons include speaking the truth, sharing history, individual stories, and testimonies of those who lived through the Shoah, and being tolerant and empathetic to those around us. These lessons feel more poignant and important than ever in our modern times. I was shocked last year when reports said that 31% of Americans and 41% of millennials believe that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Reported that 41 Americans didn't even know what Auschwitz was, and 52% of Americans think that Hitler came to power through force and not by an election. And this is the world that we live in. And in this world, anti-Semitism and hate are living comfortably in the open and continue to spread their ugliness all across the world. It was less than 2 years ago when hundreds of neo-Nazis and white supremacists came together to chant, "Jews will not replace us," and blood and soil in our own country. It was just 6 months ago when horrific murders took place during a Shabbat service in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and only a week ago in a Chabad in Poway. And while our community is the one that is often gravely targeted, we are not the only group experiencing this modern wave of hate. When I think of the tragedies in New Zealand and over the holiday in Sri Lanka, it's very easy to get overwhelmed and demoralized, as it seems that every day is met with another heartbreak. But there's something we can do, and that's why we're all here in this room together. While being involved with the Young Friends in the Museum of Jewish Heritage has given me countless cherished friendships and a flourishing social life, it's given me a community filled with passionate individuals who all believe in the importance of our mission. I am so proud of the work that we do together and the work that we have left to do. I look forward to it. Just to wrap up, I want to thank each and every one of you. Whether or not you're here or watching this later on a recording, by participating tonight, you are taking part in our mission to never forget. Let us all work together to implement the lessons from the Holocaust into our daily lives and continue to educate and honor the memories of those who were so wrongly killed. Thank you. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Mark Wilds from MJE.
Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you all for being here and for helping us to once again create the largest Yom HaShoah gathering for young professionals in New York City. I want to also recognize Ambassador Donny who we are really honored to have with us, who we will also hear from shortly. I want to begin by thanking also the President and CEO of the museum, Jack Kliger, Lindsay Mallon, the manager of membership initiatives here at the museum, for coordinating all of the logistics and marketing to ensure the success of tonight's program. Thank you also to the members of the Young Friends Board and to the Yom HaShoah Event Committee, to Alyssa Greengrass-Summer, we just heard from, Leslie Goldman, Jacqueline Steinbach, Heather Schwartz, for being so helpful, for organizing and for actively executing production, and to MGE's West Side Director, Tara Neuer, who worked seamlessly with the Young Friends Board and Museum to market and to help bring so many people here tonight. I want to also welcome my wife Jill, our co-founder, our COO, Rabbi Ezra Cohn, and my other MGE colleagues who are here tonight, Rabbi Joshua Klein, Ruthie Brafman-Schulman, and Rachel Ben-Lisa. Special thanks, of course, to Miriam, who created and has chaired Stories from a Survivor for 7 years now. Miriam is a board member of the Young Friends and also former director at MGE. She puts her heart and soul into making this program what it is, and we are celebrating at MGE our 20th anniversary this year. 20 years of offering content-filled, rich Jewish programming for young professionals, and we are proud to be what has become the largest Yom HaShoah event in this town. We thank you, Miriam, for all that you do, and for all of you for tonight, for coming and for sharing, and for making this event so meaningful. Tonight's program is sponsored in memory of Harry and Terry Panuski of blessed memory. The Panuskis were the grandparents of my dear friend Amanda Dreyer, who's not only here, but her father is here, and I want to recognize his presence as well. Amanda just last month came up to this stage to receive MGE's Communal Service Award at our 20th dinner. And I want to also express thanks to Alan and Alyssa Pines, whose generous support helped make this event possible. And this was all done in memory of Amanda's grandparents. And I just wanted to share one thing about them. Harry and Terry Panuski were both Holocaust survivors. Harry passed away in 1986, and Terry in 2008. And after Terry passed away, Amanda took it on herself to travel to Germany to learn more about her grandmother's past. She got to meet her grandmother's Catholic classmate, Anna, who told her something that took place the morning after Kristallnacht. On her way to school that morning, Anna passed the local synagogue and Terry's house. She told Amanda that she saw all the prayer books scattered all around the desecrated synagogue, and she saw Amanda's grandmother on the floor, trying to pick up and put back together what the Nazis had just destroyed. So she got down on the ground and she helped. I tried to help gather the pieces of the broken books Anna shared. But after a while, your grandmother turned to me and she said, I'm so glad you're my friend and thank you for helping, but you need to go. I think people are starting to look. The Nazis might be watching us and we'll have problems. And I never saw your grandmother again. And the reason they never saw her again is because she had to go into hiding, which she did that night in a haystack in their barnyard. A 13-year-old girl spent the night hiding with the Siddurim, with the prayer books that she had saved from the desecrated synagogue. And miraculously, the Nazis did not find her. She remained in hiding with her family until they could secure sponsorships to come to the United States. And when she came to these great shores, she brought those prayer books with her. And Amanda gave me one of them tonight, which I have. And it's just an incredible thing that we can still daven. This is a machzor from Pesach, the Passover holiday that we just celebrated. And last week on Pesach, I was serving as a scholar in residence in one of these hotels in Florida, if you know what I'm talking about. And before the second night Seder, I decided to share some ideas and stories that I thought the guests could use at their Seder. And I opened up this book and I started reading about some hero that somehow had some kind of Passover in Bergen-Belsen. And as I'm reading from the book, an elderly man stood up in the back and proudly declared, "My name is Yaakov Gross, and I was bar mitzvahed in Bergen-Belsen." So I turned to Mr. Gross and I said, "Would you like to come and share your story?" And Mr. Gross said, No, I don't want to interrupt your class. I'm like, the class is interrupted. He says, No. I said, "Mr. Gross, I'm just reading from a book. Thankfully, we have you here with us in person. Please tell us the story." And he walked to the front of the room. And this very heavy Hungarian accent, he told us that he was 12 and a half. And he was deported to Bergen-Belsen with his family. And in the Nazis' attempt to show the Red Cross that they were treating the residents of Bergen-Belsen in a humane fashion, they wanted to give him and a few other boys in the camp a bar mitzvah. And the Nazi guard asked Yaakov, "What do you do at a bar mitzvah?" So Yaakov explained that a bar mitzvah boy gets an aliyah. We get called up to the Torah to say a blessing. So the Nazis got a Torah. They set up a table in the middle of the camp. And they gathered 6 12-year-old boys for their bar mitzvah. They wouldn't make the blessings until they had a minyan. So they pulled 10 older men, created a minyan. And one by one, the boys were called up to the Torah for their aliyot. The news spread pretty quickly that there was a Sefer Torah in the camp. And hundreds of men started walking out of their bunks, forming a line, all with the hope of getting an aliyah. Mr. Gross told our group that the line looked like it was a mile long. He said there were thousands of people who stood for hours. They were hungry, they were exhausted from their work, but they were waiting for the chance to say a blessing over the Torah. "What a Kiddush Hashem," said Mr. Gross. "What an honor to God, to Torah, to our Jewish traditions, which can never be taken from us." And this is the message I wanted to share with you this evening. We have joined tonight to commemorate the devastation that was the Holocaust, to memorialize the 6 million who perished for simply being Jewish. But we're here for another equally important reason, and that is to ensure that the rich Jewish life our grandparents enjoyed and celebrated in Europe for centuries, that the Siddurim they prayed from, the Torah scrolls they read from and made blessings over, that they would continue to live on through us, the next generation. We're here tonight not only to remember those who perished, we're here to ensure that we carry on the values that our grandparents lived and the rich Jewish traditions that they celebrated. And by coming here tonight to hear a wonderful, wonderful survivor, Manny Lindenbaum, tell his story, you ensure that the Holocaust is transmitted to another generation. But by being engaged in something authentically Jewish, we can do something even more important. We can give expression to the life of Torah and mitzvot that our grandparents and great-grandparents lived for centuries, the Shabbat they observed. Whether maybe we take a class on Judaism, we learn how to read Hebrew, we consider coming to Israel, July 27th, MGE's trip, little plug. There is no better way of giving honor to those whose lives were taken than by living some of that life ourselves. And that's really what MGE is about, to explore Jewish life, to get inspired, and to engage in our Jewish tradition. Anti-Semitism, as Alyssa said, is unfortunately still alive and well. But as the heroic rabbi of that synagogue in San Diego, which was attacked, he said so beautifully, our response to darkness is to share light. Our response to evil is to do good, and therefore we must redouble our efforts to live a Jewish life. And he called upon all Jews to come to shul this Shabbos, and I invite you. It doesn't have to be to MG, although it's pretty good. Friday night, tomorrow night at 6:30, Saturday morning at 9:30. We're having a special kiddush in memory of Lori Kay, who was killed in the attack. And as you will soon hear from our special guest this evening, Manny Lindenbaum didn't just survive. He's devoted his life to helping refugees from all over the world. He's become an activist for refugees in Darfur. And in doing so, he also remains true to our Jewish tradition of giving back. And so I thank you all for coming tonight. And my blessing and my hope is that we all follow the examples of Harry and Terry Panuski, of Yaakov Gross, and of Manny Lindenbaum, by not only remembering those who perished, but by also remaining true to the traditions and the celebrations of Judaism that they lived and that they so loved. Thank you for coming. We are now honored to hear from Ambassador Donny, Israel's Consul General, who shares some words at this time. Ambassador.
Good evening. One of the most famous testimonies in the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi officer that was brought to justice in Jerusalem in the early 60s. In one of the most famous testimonies of that trial, Yechiel Dinur, a survivor of Auschwitz that became an Israeli author, better known by his pen name Zetnik, which loosely translated to English means concentration camper. He called Auschwitz another planet, a different planet, like it was a piece of land that didn't belong to planet Earth. He continued testifying, and a few minutes later, he fainted. A few days later, he was asked, "Why did you faint? You were obviously overwhelmed by the memories that came back to your mind." And he replied, "No, not at all. I can deal with those memories. I deal with them every single day. The reason I fainted is that my eyes met Eichmann's eyes. In that split second, I suddenly understood that the Shoah, that the Holocaust, was done by men, by human beings. It was not a diabolic creation of some satanic force. There were human beings that did it. And that thought I couldn't bear. I always have a dilemma if Yom HaShoah is a day to speak or to be silent. In the Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes, in the book of Mishlei, that according to our tradition was written by the wisest man that ever existed, King Solomon, another Jewish tradition. There is a verse that says, Et ledaber ve'et lakashot. There is a time to speak and there is a time to be silent. And every Yom HaShoah ask myself whether Yom HaShoah it is time to ledaber, to speak, or to lakashot, to be silent. And I think that Yom HaShoah is one of those extraordinary days in which we have to do both. And that's probably the reason that in Israel yesterday, actually this morning, the country came to a 2-minute standstill in which the whole country ceased every operation, came to paralyze itself, and in silence and in grief and in remembering. But later, we talk a lot about what happened to our people. And I think that we as Jews, we as human beings, have 4 mitzvot, 4 obligations that are particular to Yom HaShoah. And not only to Yom HaShoah, actually, to the memory of the Holocaust, not only in Yom HaShoah. The first one is to mourn. I believe that Yom HaShoah is not a day to raise flags. It's not even a day in which we like to do it because it fulfills some psychological need that we have as human beings to say, ultimately, we defeated the Nazis because we are here and we are children and grandchildren. No, I believe that it's a day to mourn, to shed tears, to bow heads. The second mitzvah that I think that we have in Yom HaShoah is to know. And it's very common to say that we have to know because in a few years, hopefully more than a few, we will not have with us survivors that will tell the story. So we have an obligation to know. But I think that that's not the only reason we should know. I think that we should know because we owe that to the survivors and we owe that to the victims. I think about that woman, I don't know, probably in his 30s, probably in his 40s, 50s, probably her name was Hannah, or maybe Rivka, that was taken pushed to the shul in Bialystok or in Vilna, and cramped with all her neighbors and family and friends and congregation to that small shul, and the shul set afire, killing them all. Probably her last thought was, I hope that people will know what happened to me. I hope someone in the future, people in the future will know what they did to me. And I think we have to fulfill that thought. Not only for the future generations, but also for the generation that perished in the Shoah. I always think about that child from the Greek island of, let's say, Crete or Rhodes, that was taken from his family and shipped to the sea, to the mainland, only to be pushed to a cattle wagon and taken to Auschwitz to be immediately gassed to death. He also, I'm sure, he thought, I hope I am not forgotten. I hope that in the future generation, Jews and Gentiles will know what happened to me. We deserved it. We owe that to them. The third mitzvah that I believe we have is to identify with them. Probably the most difficult of all of them. We read a few days ago, a week ago, in the Haggadah, in the Seder, we read, בכל דור ודור חייב אדם לראות את עצמו כאילו הוא יצא ממצרים. In every generation has every person to see himself or herself as if he or she personally left Egypt. And I'm not sure I understand that passage. How do you do that? But I know that since the Shoah, בכל דור ודור חייב אדם לראות את עצמו כאילו הוא שוחרר מאושוויץ. In every generation has every human being, at least every decent human being, to see himself or herself as if he or she endured the atrocities and then was liberated from Auschwitz. In some sense, I feel it that even to symbolically share the burden with them, to tell them you are not alone, we are here with you. And the fourth mitzvah that I believe we have is to learn a lesson, to learn lessons. And let's be sincere, there are different lessons that we are entitled to learn from the Holocaust, from the Shoah. Some of us learn personal lessons, some of us learn national lessons, some of us learn universal lessons. Some of us, you can find two persons that genuinely, sincerely learn contradictory lessons from the Holocaust. And I believe that every lesson that is learned by a decent person and is genuine and sincere is Divrei Elohim Chaim, is the word of true God. But obviously, as a person that considers himself also decent, I am also entitled to my lesson. And my lesson as a staunch Zionist is that the most important guarantee for preventing another catastrophe for the Jewish people, for making sure that never again Leolam Lo'od is not just an empty cliche that is recited without really meaning it in Yom HaShoah by Jews and non-Jews. I believe that the guarantee for that is a strong, robust, independent Jewish state, Medinat Israel, the state of Israel. And if I have one more minute, I will conclude with a personal story. I visited Auschwitz, I think it was 10 years ago. I didn't want to go to the March of the Living because I didn't think that that will be the way in which I will really feel the Auschwitz. And my wife didn't want to join me. She thought it was too difficult for her, and I went alone. And at some stage, I arrived to the Israeli pavilion there. And there were groups of teenagers from an Israeli high school in northern Israel. And they were seated on the floor, reciting, reading passages, reading letters from survivors and from victims and singing. And they invited me to sit with them on the floor. I was already, I don't know, in my 50s. And I couldn't control my... I cried. I cried and cried and cried and shed tears. And suddenly, I will not forget this to the end of my life. This 14, 15-year-old Israeli youngster, she was most probably from Moroccan descent. She saw me, her eyes, a different pair of eyes that I referred at the beginning, met my eyes. And without saying one word, she reached to her purse and took a tissue. And without saying one word, she gave it to me to wipe my tears. And she took another one to wipe her tears. And that was for me a moment of bonding, of Jewish solidarity over a tissue in the Israeli pavilion in Auschwitz that I will never forget to the end of my life.
Thank you, Ambassador Diane. It is now my honor to introduce this year's speaker, Manny Lindenbaum, who will come to the stage to light a candle in honor of the 6 million men, women, and children who perished. Thank you. Now I will ask that you all just join me in one more moment of silence and reflection. Thank you. I am pleased to now turn this evening's program over to Miriam Leichtling and Manny Lindenbaum.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who's spoken so far. I'm going to keep my words short so that we can hear from Manny. I will begin by saying, though, that every year that I do this, I think, I don't know, should I do it again? And then I look out into the crowd, and now I know that we're also online. and I see a sea of faces. And when I started doing this event, there were people who told me, no one's going to show up. It's really hard to get young professionals to come to a Yom HaShoah event. And now I see that that's just not true. And I invite everybody who's here tonight, in addition to hearing Manny's story, to take on the responsibility to hear somebody else's story as well. There are only a few thousand people left who are eyewitnesses. We become the next generation of witnesses. And by being here tonight, you're not only hearing a story, you're training yourselves to become storytellers in the future. So thank you for that. And thank you for Manny for being here. Often when we hear stories of the Holocaust, or we hear about hearing about a story of the Holocaust, we think Auschwitz, we think Treblinka, we think concentration camps. But the truth is that there are so many different facets of the Holocaust. Some people didn't go to camps. Some people didn't hide in attics. Some people's stories are more subtle. Some people's trauma is more subtle. But it is as necessary and as important to hear those stories. Not only because they happened, not only because they were part of our collective story as a Jewish people, but because there are vital stories and lessons to be learned there. It's sometimes in those more subtle stories, the stories where there is no concentration camp, the stories where someone escaped before the war began, that we can connect more because there are aspects that perhaps remind us of stories that we've heard in other places as well. And the more we hear these stories, the more empathetic we can become, the more we can go out there into the world and help others based on the stories that we know from our own history. Manny's is such a story. Manny, the majority of Manny's story, or at least the first half of it, happened before the war even broke out. Manny was a child on the kinder transport, one of the last children on the kinder transport. He left Germany and Poland before 1940. That's before the majority of the concentration camps began. That's before the majority of the ghettos were established. And yet there is so much story there to hear. I was excited to hear from Manny tonight because it's really important that we hear these stories as well, that we don't corner ourselves into thinking that there is only one kind of Holocaust story. And I'm not at all taking away from those stories. But there are so many others, and that's what we're here tonight to hear. So I'm going to begin by giving a little framing, and then I'm going to hand it over to Manny, and Manny's going to tell you his story. And I'm going to begin by saying that I met Manny on a bicycle ride. This guy right here rode 200 miles across Europe at the age of
83.
83. Now, personally, that could be the story and that's it. And I could sit here all night and hear that. But I organize bike rides when I'm not sharing Holocaust stories. And Manny was at an event that I was running, and it was a 1-hour time slot, and he said that he would be happy to share his story of being a child on the kinder transport. I walked in, he started his story. I think I had to shoo people out of the room after an hour and a half. People were just completely engaged, and I walked up to him, and this was in August, right? I said, Manny, I've got a job for you. And here we are. In 1938, there were ghettos were not what people were worried about quite yet. The war had not broken out yet. But it was the beginning of what was to become the Holocaust. Germans took away the passports, the rights of German Jews, and decided that they didn't want them in their country. Initially, it was not about killing people. It was just about getting them out. We don't want them. And they took 17,000 Jews within just a couple of days and pushed them to the Polish border. This was known as the Polish Action. The Polish Action, in some ways, brought upon Kristallnacht, which was when many synagogues were burnt and destroyed and Jewish businesses were destroyed. And that was what spurred the Kindertransport. People in the world heard what was going on. They said this is not okay. It was in Britain, actually. And they took somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 children without their parents. Generally, they were children who had a parent who was already in a deportation camp. They were children who were homeless. They were children who didn't have parents who could take care of them anymore, and brought them to Britain. And this is the era, this is the time period that Manny's story begins. So Manny, turning over to you, because really nobody wants to hear me talk. They want to hear you talk. Why don't you tell us where you're from?
Well, I'm from Jackson, New Jersey. What I'd like to tell you, this thing isn't working? Oh, well, what I'd like to tell you is how my family got to Germany. And I think it's a very important lesson to learn. My family was in Dolina in Galicia, and we're talking about the year 1903, more or less. And things were not good. They were not, the local people were not friendly. It was hard to make a living. And they searched for a place where they could move to, where they would be welcomed. And they did find such a place. They moved to Germany. And in Germany, my father was 10 years old at that point. They moved to Hanover. They started a clothing business. When my father got married, he moved to a small town in Germany, Unna, in the Ruhr Valley. And my earliest memories there, we had a small clothing store. We lived in a small apartment above the store. And my memory is going back to when I was maybe 5 years old, or 4 or 5 years old. My sister, there were 3 Jewish girls in her class out of 43. And my sister had at least 20 friends, and they were always around. My parents had Jewish friends, but they had many more Christian friends. And there really wasn't discrimination in our town. And then a depression came along. People were out of work. The trains didn't run. And people were scared. And it was a democracy. The election was a free election. And the good people of Germany, they chose not to hear the words of a Nazi who said, in order for us, we are going to make Germany great again. We are not going to have people with disabilities. We're not going to have communists, and we're not going to have Jews. And I'm positive that a good percentage of the population were uncomfortable with what they heard. But he also said he was going to create prosperity. And they voted for him, and they elected him. And Hitler became the freely elected Chancellor of Germany. And people who had children with disabilities had to hide them. They couldn't let them out in public. He started to carry out all his promises. The kids in school wore uniforms and strutted around, and they had to look on they did look on everybody else as Niedermenschen, as a lower form of life, because the Germans were so much better than anybody else. And my father had to put a J in the window on his store, and slowly our good Christian friends they had become bystanders. There was no action against what was happening. They stopped being our friends, not by taking action, but I remember my sister's friends, one by one, not coming around anymore. My brother, who was going to school, would come home beaten up. And this was every day. My mother went to the school and spoke to the teacher and said, "What is going on?" And he said there's nothing he could do. An absolute lie, because any place in Germany where people did stand up, and in Europe later, where people did stand up, it made a huge difference. But in my opinion, the Holocaust came about not because of the evil people, but because of the bystanders who were quiet. In 1938, 2 weeks before Kristallnacht, I do have a memory of being in the store when a German officer came in and said, "Report to the police station." And people have asked me, "What were you doing? What were your parents thinking? Why didn't they just leave?" Well, they couldn't leave because every door in the world, including America, the doors were closed. The British Empire, the doors were closed. There was really no place to go. People with money could get out on a tourist visa. Some people could get to Shanghai, but the world had closed its doors on refugees. It does have a familiar ring today, and things were horrible. We had no choice, and I remember my father took us all to our very close Christian friend, and they agreed there was no choice. We had to go to the police station. It was October the 27th. The reason I'm choking up, October the 27th of this past year, the 80th anniversary of when we were rounded up, in effect, that the Jews were killed at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And it was the same day, and I remember waking up that morning before I heard the news, and I felt a dark cloud as memories came back to me of the October the 27th, 80 years earlier. And later, when I heard the news, I was devastated. We did go to the police station. It was Thursday. The October 27th was Shabbat. Well, they kept us at the train station. They didn't let us get on the trains until the sun went down on Friday night. And the only explanation I could have for that is my Zeta, who was a very religious Jew, and as were others. And it was just these so-called supermen's way of making themselves feel good by the suffering of a Niedermensch, of a lower form of life. We did get on the train when the sun went down, and one of my beautiful memories, which has never left me, is with all the tension, my grandfather starting Friday night services with me sitting on his lap on the train, and that memory is very, very vivid. When we got to the Polish border, and while there was a total of 17,000, there were not 17,000 on our train because the trains had come from all over Germany, and they chased us across the border. My blind Zeta, my mother, my father, my sister, and me, and the Polish guards did try to keep us out, but were quickly overwhelmed, and we were in Poland. And then a scene took place which, I'm sorry to say, takes place today, that people who came to help with horses and carts actually came to steal the suitcases of many people, and then they left. They did not come to help. And we walked about 5 miles from Benchen, which was the German side, to a Polish town by the name of Spongen. And when we got there, it was amazing. It was a small town. The people did not greet us with hostility. Some people who had money were able to rent places. Some people slept on the ground. Some people slept in the stables. There was a burnt mill that my family spent the next 10 months in. We were up on the 3rd or 4th floor. There was no electric, there was no heat, there was nothing up there. But within 24 hours, the Joint and Highest arrived. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society arrived, and they provided us with organizations so that everybody had food to eat. They provided us with cotton sacks onto which we could put straw so we didn't sleep on the ground. And for me, this was not the worst day of my life, the worst time of my life. During those 10 months, I had my family, I had a friend, and the local population did not harass us. There's many horrible stories about Polish complicity. It didn't happen when we arrived in Spongen. And in Spongen, my mother and my sister were initially part of a group which helped to make sure that everybody had enough to eat. And for me, this was not a horrible time. A kid adapts very, very quickly. When I arrived, I was 6. When 10 months later, some of the people who had money or who had good connections were able to get to Shanghai or to the Dominican Republic, a few, but the fact is that the world had shuttered the gates to make sure that no Jews were going to be able to get anywhere. Two members of the House of Representatives introduced a bill to let 20,000 kids come into the United States to save their lives. They couldn't get it out of committee, and eventually I think 1,100 did get into the United States. In England, which had actually sunk a boat of refugees trying to get to Palestine, the Quakers and the Jewish groups in England got them to agree to take in 10,000 kids. And at this point, the 10,000 kids were there already. And the German army is on the border, and there's a lot of hysterics, and the organizations gets us all down to the train station where they're attempting to get us to Grodno, and there somebody announced that there was a possibility of getting some kids on the Kindertransport. My Zeta at this point was at a Jewish home for the blind in Warsaw. My sister was at an Ort camp, learning a trade and having her education. Me and my brother were there. My mother and father took me and my brother and took us over to this man, and they turned around and walked away and got on a train to Grodno. And this is probably the most traumatic moment of my life. They turned their back on me, and I didn't understand that they were heroes saving my life. My friend Herbert started to cry, and his mother came and kissed and hugged him and took him with her. And I found out that 2 years later they were both murdered in Auschwitz, and I wiped the memory of my mother and father out of my mind to the extent that to this day, I can't really visualize them, although I have nothing but love and respect that they pushed me over to this. We went across Poland for 10 days. We stopped at the Ort village, and I remember one of the that was really stuck in my mind. There was a real bed there that I laid on at the camp, and the food and the candy, and my Zeta stopped in because Warsaw was nearby, and then my sister joined us, and we went to Danzig, and there was a Polish troop ship there by the name of the Warszawa, and when we got there, some idiot decided that my sister was too old and was not eligible. I'm sure it was the decision of one person, because many 16, 17, and even 18-year-olds had gone on the Kindertransport before. And I remember running away. I remember my sister finding me and dragging me back to the boat and held me down while they shaved my hair because they wouldn't let me on with the lice. And then my sister left, and later, much later, I found out years later, when maybe 20 years later, maybe 30 years later, I found out that she had crossed Poland, had got to Grodno, and was living with my mother and father in a small room, and that she had a job and that she was studying English so she'd be able to speak to me. And I also found out that my mother, my father, and my sister Ruchen and my blind Zeta were all murdered in Auschwitz 2 years later. And at that point, I arrived in England with my brother. What the British did was unbelievable, because they saved the lives of 10,000 children. And every one of those children had a different experience. My brother, who was not a screaming lunatic like I was at that point, he was 2 years older, was taken in by a nice Jewish family, and I spent the next 2 or 3 years going from one Christian home to the other, and everybody had a hard time with me. But there were angels. There were people who went out of their way and reached out. And when I talk to kids in schools, I always tell them that when you see somebody in trouble the way I was, when you reach out to them, you can really change a life and you can make a difference in people's lives. I went to a reunion 70 years after the event, and a reporter came up to me, a Kindertransporter Union, and said, tell me 2 or 3 sentences that I can put in a headline. And I gulped, and I said, I would like to say thank you to Mrs. Knowles, the wife of the vicar, that's a minister, in Ely, because she made such a difference in my life, the way she reached out. He actually took out a cell phone and made a call and told me to get on the phone, and I had no idea who I was speaking to, and neither did the person at the other end. And then I said, don't you remember your daughter came home from college and gave me a stamp collection, and I still have it? And that was the daughter. And we had a beautiful conversation. So when I gave him the phone back, I said, how did you have the phone number? He says, do you really think you were the only one she helped? She reached out to all the refugee kids who were in trauma and made a difference in their lives. And I had others along the way. If you'd like to ask a question, you could. I need a rest.
Okay. I'm usually that person, by the way. Anybody who knows me well knows that I'm usually the one who has the stories. Yes, questions. I'm trying to collect the energy of the room, but I'm going to rewind a little bit. It was you, it was your brother, and it was your older sister, Ruth. And you have talked about how the trauma of your parents leaving you on the platform that day was life-changing, not in a positive way, although it was, because here you are, but that your sister became a mother figure to you. Can you share some of the stories or the feelings that you had when you think about your sister?
When I got to the United States, and the way I got to the United States was, and I heard this story not from my uncle, but from somebody else. He was in an internment camp in Holland, and he saw a pregnant woman getting kicked in the stomach. And like Moses, he was a hothead. Moses was a hothead when he killed the god. And my uncle went over and beat the god and was beaten to a pulp himself and thrown on a train to be taken to his death back home. And Holland was a bad place to be because most of the people in hiding were given up. It was the worst country. And however, there was an underground, there were people who made a difference. They got him off the train, they took him to a man by the name of Jaap Pendrik, who I met, who gave false papers to 1,200 Jewish young men. And with that, they all survived. With that, he was able to get from Holland to France to Africa. And he wrote to a brother who got a hold of, had a contact with Bronfman, a very influential person who got him to the United States in 1942. And he brought me here in 1946. And Hayes helped him to get to the United States. Hayes helped us get to the United States, me and my brother. When my brother went into a hospital, when he got here for 5 months, Temple University Hospital in Philadelphia, it was Hayes. And I'm so proud to be working with Hayes today as they help refugees around the world. And I think it fills me with so much joy. And I've always volunteered for things, and the reason I feel this compunction, I've never been able to get past the fact that my sister died. She should have been on that boat and not me. And the only way I can justify to my existence to myself is to be doing something to make a difference. And I always feel her with me. I don't think there's a day in my life that I haven't thought about her. And at one point, I was speaking at the Holocaust Center in Brookdale, and they were my grandchildren, and Nina, who's here, she spoke to my granddaughter, and I said, I have to go back, and I have to retrace the steps, because, I don't know, maybe 30 years later, from cousins in Israel, my parents, even when they were in concentration camps, managed to get letters out through the Red Cross. I never saw any of them, but they were given to me from cousins, which was Palestine, obviously Israel, and I had, in one of the letters, my mother wrote, and this was after she had written many letters pleading for $10 to provide warm clothes for her children, or to provide something, because we had absolutely nothing. And there goes my 87 brain.
We were talking about your sister and why she's important and why.
Yeah. So in this letter, thank you. This happens to me fairly regularly. In this last letter, before she was killed, she spoke about the beauty of the countryside where they were marching her from one camp to the other, about the beauty of the sky and the beauty of the trees. And to me, Poland was a dark cloud, Germany was a dark cloud, and German people were a dark cloud to me. And every time I met one, my stomach would tighten up, and and I hated it, and I had to do something about it, and I did. When I volunteered at places, I found German people all over the place. When I volunteered on kibbutz, there were Germans on kibbutz as volunteers. When I went to demonstrations for civil rights, there were German people. When I went for environmental things, there were German people. When I was doing a workshop in prison, which I've done dozens and dozens of, alternative to violence, I got a call from a German woman who heard that a survivor was with this Quaker group going into prisons, and she said, "Can I come in to help?" And I said, "No, but you could come and take the 3-day workshop, so maybe you could become a trainer eventually." And she came in, and I found the most sensitive person in the world who opened up my eyes that she was a third-generation German, and her parents were Nazis. Her grandparents were Nazis. And she couldn't bring the subject up. She couldn't ask. She was forbidden to go to her grandparents' house. And she had nonstop trauma. And how could I possibly have any ill feelings to the next generation of Germans? And I didn't. And when I finally did the Odyssey, called it Odyssey 76, I think my grandson Jacob put it online. I couldn't do it ended up being 1,780 miles, but the last 200 miles we did do on a bicycle, because I didn't want to come back to my hometown in Germany on a train. and somebody from my hometown joined us, and a young man, and he has told me that he is working with refugees from Syria and from Afghanistan in Germany, and he's teaching them German. And his expression was that they are us. And when I talk to kids, and I talk to anybody, I don't think there's much differences between people. And bad things can only happen if the good people are bystanders. And all of us need to not be bystanders, but when we see something that we don't like, we have to be active, and we have to make a difference, and that's the reason I speak.
So we just have time for one or two more questions. You mentioned that you know, listening to your story, what we see is a trajectory of just becoming more and more abandoned. You started your story, you had your father, you had your mother, you had your sister, your brother, your grandfather. When you moved across the border, your sister and grandfather went to different places. When you got put on the kinder transport, you lost your parents, you never saw them again. When you got on the boat to go to England, you lost your sister, who was a mother figure to you. You mentioned that getting to England was hard, and that, what did you say, a screaming lunatic? But I'll point out that you did tell me something about being 5 years old and sneaking away to a Nazi rally by yourself, and that maybe your mom was a little mad at you. So you've always had spunk, and you've used it for the good for the majority of your life. But can you tell us a little bit about, you know, you say you work with a lot of refugees and a lot of children who are in hard spots. What was it like to be a child? You were young. How, 8 years old? 7 years old?
I was 6 years.
6. So you were 6. You had been homeless for...
7 when I was by myself.
7 by yourself. So you were homeless for 10 months with your family. You were put on a train. You weren't with your brother, right? Your brother and you were in two different places.
In England, no.
Yeah. Did you see your brother when you were in England, or were you in different places?
After I'd been in England close to 3 years, a stranger came up to me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Do you know who I am?" I had no idea. That was my brother. But, you know, when I hear about children being separated from their parents, my experience was that I did become a raving lunatic. I was, in England, caning was very common. And I would get caned on a regular basis because I drove the poor teachers absolutely crazy. And it took me a long time to get over the anger. I finally, when I was 10 years old and I had learned nothing, absolutely nothing, and tormented all the teachers, when I was 10 years old, I was put into a class with a teacher, a woman, who didn't cane me and quieted down my anger and was able in 1 year to teach me enough so I could pass the 11s, which was a test you took in England to see if you could go to high school. And I passed it, but it took me much longer than that to get myself equalized, to find some balance of who I was. And I think if it wasn't that I thought so much about my sister and the fact that I have to justify why I'm here, I don't think my life would have been what it is. And now my poor children and grandchildren, I kind of expect them, and they do. They tell me how they're making a difference, and Ruth is smiling down on us. And that's the important thing in my life, that there's a reason why I'm here, And it's to try to make a difference. And I don't do enough, but I do some.
So we're going to finish with one last question. You mentioned to me in our talks that you didn't tell your story for a long time, that you didn't talk about this with your children, which is not uncommon. A lot of people who have gone through trauma, a lot of people who are in the Holocaust, don't talk about it. But that eventually you came around and you started talking. And I've interviewed a lot of survivors, and I can say you are a prolific speaker. You speak all over this place. You speak to children, adults, young professionals. What changed? What was the thing that made you decide to go from not talking at all to becoming the advocate, to becoming the storyteller that you are? And in closing, with 400 people in the room and more online, what is the one thing, if people walk out of this room, what is the message that you want to share with people in this world, room and in the world?
The one thing that I want to share, and that I hope that I never become a bystander, because I think that, I tell kids a story to try to put it on their level of 100 kids come out of school and 2 kids beat a kid up, and this happened at a school near me, and they sent the kid to the hospital. He was really injured badly, and 80 kids turned around in disgust and 20 stood and watched. And I'm convinced that the 80 who turned around in disgust, they were the ones who were responsible for that kid getting into the hospital. Nobody said anything. I always tell them, I don't want you to jump into the middle of a fight and get injured, but there's all kinds of other things you can do. And if you read something in the paper that is upsetting to you, write a letter, make a phone call, even if you're 10 years old. As a matter of fact, when people in Congress or wherever get letters from young people, they pay more attention than if they get them from older people. They really do. And so I'm sure that everybody here is going to make a difference in the world. And I didn't speak to my children because I didn't want them to have trauma, and they probably had more trauma because of that. And I did speak to my grandchildren, and I think that was probably the right thing to do. And just 2 days ago, I was at Nina's, she teaches Hebrew school, and I was talking to her kids. And I feel I need to speak. I need to make a difference. When we were on a bike ride recently in Tucson, my wife Annabelle, who's here, we walked across the border with the head of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and a Christian minister, and I wanted to see what the horrible people on the other side were like, and I saw hundreds of kids with their parents in a long line, waiting very patiently for 2 or 3 hours to get a meal. I saw where they were sleeping on the border. I heard about the fear they had of going back. There's no easy answers, and the thing that drives me insane is any idea of separating a young child from the parents, because I know that it came close to ruining me forever, and these kids will not get over that very quickly. So what can we do? We can write a letter. We can make a phone call. We can look in our own conscience about how we see the world and fight for a world as the way we see would be good.
Manny, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to give you a hug.